Okay, so now we are finally into the final video for this week, and we'll finish off the Constitution Act here. So still some federal provincial issues. Section 109 is the one sleeper in the Act. Section 109 gives all lands, mines, minerals, royalty, natural resources to the provinces as of 1867. If John A. Macdonald had known the importance of natural resources come the 20th century, oil, gas, hydroelectricity, he would have taken those powers, made sure that those powers would stay with the federal government. But as it is, 109, natural resources go to the provinces, and that's one of the reasons why the provinces are so significant economically as they are today, and certainly the Western provinces, Alberta, right? So 109, natural resources go to the provinces. Section 118, you see it's been repealed, but I did want to mention what was there. What was there was the beginning of federal-provincial financial relations, where the federal government would be supporting provinces financially. That's been repealed, and then there's a whole new host of federal-provincial fiscal relations existing in other pieces of legislation. But just appreciate that federal provincial fiscal relations are an ongoing event that is subject to enormous, enormous discussion. Section 121 allows for provincial free trade. It's never happened. Provinces have always resisted and put up their own barriers to trade. But officially, as of 1867, there was to be free trade within and between the provinces. That's never come to pass. It's still an issue, a policy issue of interest to federal and provincial governments today. Section 133 deals with language rights. And it makes French and English official languages in the federal parliament. And it makes French and English official languages in the legislature of Quebec. And it makes French and English official languages in the courts of Canada and in the courts of Quebec. Section 133 is one of two provisions in the Constitution Act of 1867 dealing with rights. The other one was Section 93 dealing with religious education minority rights. So Section 133 is the beginning of some form of French English language rights in the country. And then one final one to take a look at briefly, Section 146 is the power for the federal government to create new provinces. And new provinces coming in are subject to approval by the Parliament of Canada. And as we go through the course, we'll be talking about the admission of new provinces into the country. So that's the Constitution Act and all of the key provisions that you need to know. As you're looking at this now, be thinking there are two glaring omissions. In 1867, Canada did not get a Bill of Rights. Canada did not get a Charter of Rights. And most of what you see here deals with the rights of governments, what powers the federal government has, what powers the provincial governments have, how do those powers relate, whose power is superior to the other. And then, of course, what you see here is that there is a hierarchy that ultimately, in this document, the British imperial government stands supreme over the federal Canadian government, and the federal Canadian government is over and superior to the provincial governments. There's no Bill of Rights. There's nothing here that talks about individual rights. That comes in 1982 with the Charter of Rights. And with this core, as we get in towards that time, we'll be looking at the politics leading up to the Charter of Rights in 1982. But you do note here that the only two provisions that deal with rights, Section 93, religious minority education rights, and Section 133, language rights, these are listed as collective rights. The rights of the Roman Catholic linguistic minority in Ontario, the rights of the Protestant English minority, linguistic minority in Quebec. Here in Section 133, it's well the rights of the French language right to the right of the French language to be used in the Parliament of Canada and in the legislature of Quebec, the right of French and English to be used in federal courts and in the courts of Quebec. Those are collective rights, not individual rights. So it's interesting how the Fathers of Confederation don't see the need for a charter of individual rights. They certainly knew the idea of a Bill of Rights. You know, the Americans had a Bill of Rights going all the way back to 1787. The Fathers of Confederation said, well, we don't need that. Yeah, Parliament and legislatures will protect the rights of people. So they thought. The other so at one level, then of course, in the 20th century, there's an increasing call for constitutional reform where we need a Bill of Rights, we need a Charter of Rights. And that becomes a quest of Pierre Trudeau from the 1950s on. And we'll follow that story leading up to the creation of the Canadian Charter of Rights in 1982. Of course, the other omission here in the Constitution Act of 1867 is there's no amending formula. If you want to change this, if governments want to change this, amend this, improve upon this, how do they do it? Most constitutions have a formal amending formula. The Americans do. Again, the Fathers of Confederation knew this. So how does this get amended? As we'll see, we'll talk about this in future weeks once we get into the constitutional conventions. But basically, appreciate what this is. Back in 1867, this was known as the British North America Act, and this act was ultimately passed not in Canada. Back in 1867, before Confederation, there was no Canadian Parliament, no federal Parliament. This document was passed by the British government in London. This was a British act. And it's this act that created the Canadian federal system and the federal government. So no Canadian Parliament could pass this because there was no Canadian Parliament until this act came into effect. And that happened when this became law in England in 1867. So this was the British North America Act. This was a piece of British parliamentary legislation, British law that created the Canadian political system as we know it. So, as Macdonald understood, well, if you want to change this, it will have to be done in London. This is British law, not Canadian. And if Canadians want to make an amendment to this, we would have to notify the British government and speak to the British and mention to them what type of changes we want. Appreciate in the 1860s, the British were quite happy to see this coming to pass. The British were happy to see the Canadians developing this constitutional reform and creating a separate quasi-independent country of Canada, quasi-independent because we're still very much subject to British law if need be, here, reservation disallowance. The British were happy to see the Canada becoming a semi-independent entity. where much of what Canada what would happen in Canada would be governed by the Canadians themselves and not the British government back in London. But it was understood that ultimately, if and when the Canadians wanted to change this, they would have the Canadian federal government would have to be in negotiations with the British government, and the British government would then have to amend the British North America Act pursuant to what the Canadians want. But the ultimate amendment would happen in London, not Ottawa. And then we'll talk about the politics of all of this as we get into constitutional conventions, and that will begin next week. So, folks, I know it's been a lot of stuff here, but go through the act again and listen to these videos and get your mind around the language here. And we'll come back next week and we'll begin looking at constitutional conventions. And I'll see you folks then.